Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Trudeau 2.0, a public discussion focused on Pierre's legacy and Justin's future. Thanks so much for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be a lively and productive conversation. I'm your host, Roxanne Panchasi. I'm a modern French historian and a faculty member in the Department of History at SFU. So before I introduce our three panel members, I just want to say a few words about the genesis of this evening and the plan for the next hour or so ahead. The idea for tonight is, of course, in keeping with the Department of History's public lecture series on heroes and villains. The Trudeau name certainly has inspired and continues to inspire a range of responses along these lines. Over the last couple of years, I found myself becoming more and more interested and a little bit overwhelmed by the proliferation of competing images of Justin Trudeau as either the bearer of a bright Canadian future or a political disaster who, if elected Prime Minister, will surely lead us all to ruin. And of course, representations of Justin have been tied, sometimes in complicated and sometimes in incredibly simplistic ways, to ideas about his father, Pierre, and the legacies of the Trudeau years from the 1960s through the 1980s. Now, as a historian of France who knows far less than she should about her own national history, I regularly approach my Canadianist colleagues to pick their brains and get their takes on contemporary events and debates that seem to trade on Canada's historical past. So tonight I've asked three of these colleagues to enlighten me with their thoughts and perspectives on the links between Trudeau's past and present, father and son. And instead of trapping them near the photocopier or the mailroom on Burnaby Mountain, as I usually do, I've asked them to join me here and to include all of you in that conversation. So I've prepared some questions that are anchored by a series of images, including this one that's in faded relief up there of Pierre holding Justin on his hip from years ago. And over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll let the panel members respond in turn to the questions that I've prepared and then to the images that we look at, and we'll try to save about 15 or 20 minutes towards the end for questions for the audience so that you can all become involved in the conversation. So let me introduce the members of the panel. Born in 1967, the year before Pierre Elliott Trudeau became Canada's 15th Prime Minister, Elise Chenier is a specialist in the history of sexuality and gender in 20th century North America. She currently teaches a course on the Trudeau era at SFU, and she has recently launched the Trudeaumania project, a social media campaign with aims to collect memorabilia related to Pierre Trudeau's time in power. More of a cultural historian than a political historian, Dr. Chenier's secret desire is to write a feminist biography of Margaret Trudeau. Nicolas Kenny, to my left, is a Canadian historian whose research focuses on the cultural history of cities. He teaches in the French cohort program at SFU and is currently doing research on the history of French language education in BC. Dr. Kenny is also a regular commentator on federal provincial politics for ICI Radio-Canada, the CBC's French language radio and television services in British Columbia. Finally, last but not least, Dr. Alan Seeger is a Canadian labor historian with a special interest in the history of the coal industry, mining communities in Western Canada, and the Canadian Railway. Anyone who's ever had a conversation with Alan about Canadian history and politics and been amazed, as I have, by the depth and richness of his knowledge and experience understands exactly why I implored him to participate in this panel discussion this evening. So welcome to all three of you, and thanks so much for joining me here tonight. So I want to get us started with Trudeaumania. Let's dive right in with this phenomenon known as Trudeaumania. What was it, historically speaking? What did it say about Pierre Elliott Trudeau and about the political and cultural context of Canada in the mid to late 1960s? Are we seeing a new wave of Trudeaumania today around Justin? And how is the enthusiasm for the son, such as it is, inflected with enthusiasm for, or maybe nostalgia for the enthusiasm for, the father?
That's your question?
Away we go.
Well, I'll start off by saying thanks, Roxanne, for this invitation. My arm is just recovering from the extensive twisting it endured, but I'm happy to be here. And I guess to answer, maybe I'll just give a really short answer to your very big question, is that maybe we could start off with the by-elections that happened on Monday. I think probably everyone's got that on their minds. And certainly I think it's been spun in the media in the last couple of days as an example of Trudeaumania. I mean, it was 4 by-elections. It was 2 Liberal seats that were held by the Liberals, 2 Conservative seats that were held by the Conservatives, one in which the Liberals really gave them a run for their money. But all of a sudden now there's this new narrative just this week about Justin Trudeau being the man to beat the next time around. I'm amazed at how quickly that turns, and I think that says a lot about these phenomena like manias, right? And just how they can turn on a dime. And the elections and the elections themselves, nothing I think extraordinarily surprising happened, but the twist it's gotten in the media in the last few days I think has been extraordinary.
I just want to show these 2 images to kind of bring to mind Trudeaumania past and perhaps Trudeaumania more recent. This is actually from Richmond, from a gathering where Justin Trudeau is actually lifted up by members of the crowd as like at a wedding or something. Elise or Alan, do either one of you want to comment on
this? On the subject of the by-elections, I've got the Globe and Mail today, which has an interesting editorial cartoon. Maybe the camera can see it. It's Justin with a zipper on his mouth holding polls. Liberal winning strategy. If I were a Liberal, I would really like to be an advisor to Justin and try to find a balance between zippering your trap, which is garden variety politics today, and running off on thoughts. I believe that there are some issues with Justin in terms of his own upbringing. He would have been a boy who was very much encouraged to speak his mind. He undoubtedly met all kinds of interesting people, and they enjoyed talking to a young man. And so these remarks he makes about Red China or about Jack Layton or about legalizing marijuana, all of which need to be much more carefully structured in terms of a candidate in the modern world. I think he does have a problem with communications. Whereas in his father's day, there was a very different environment. His father, I brought 2 of his anthologies along. Pierre Elliott Trudeau said incredibly outrageous things, and yet they seem to buoy him along. Elise, Trudeaumania clearly had a lot to do with sex, the sexual revolution, sex appeal. Your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I do teach. So you maybe have more firsthand experience with it. I remember the 72 and 74 election when I was 5 and 7 years old, and I remember feeling the excitement around the election and the signs going up and so on. But there's a really interesting article that was so the argument was that it was the women's vote that got Trudeau in because of his supposed sex appeal. And by the way, I show my students photos of Trudeau and they don't get it, and I say, think Austin Powers. and they laugh like you did. So it's great. It works. The problem with being a teacher is I run out of cultural references. In 5 years, they're going to say, who's Austin Powers? Yeah. But anyways, now I've completely lost my... Oh, yeah. So there was a fascinating study that was done in Hamilton, Ontario. Now, and this is what I teach my students. How representative this is for all of Canada, I don't know. But this one study completely debunked that theory. There was a gender evenness around who voted for him. So I think that whole argument has been used to undermine his political abilities to say it was more style than substance. And the argument I make with my classes, there was an awful lot of substance there. And I think that to suggest, just by looking at the picture, what to me is really interesting as a cultural historian, what's so fascinating to me about Trudeau is that he really was like a rock star. It's extraordinary the way people, the media focused on young girls screaming across Parliament Hill. And often I talk to people and they say, oh, I remember, people would recognize him and crowds would, kind of like the Beatles or something like that. So he was this kind of phenomenon. Now, we also know now that his team constructed that a little bit. So they set up, he was also one of the first politicians to go to shopping malls and places like that. And he was very, as Marshall McLuhan said, he was a cool face for a cool medium. He really knew how to work the camera, which is interesting because I don't know how he learned it, because there's some footage of him on Quebec television in the 60s, and he's horrible. He's absolutely horrible. So what happened, I don't know, but anyhow.
Well, television changed as well. I mean, the media itself developed, and Trudeau was really our first prime minister to, look at his predecessors, Pearson and Diefenbaker, who were staid, who were stiff. And they came at a time Trudeau came at a time when, television was exploding as a media. I mean, he was, as some have put it, our first Kennedy, right? He was the first to be able to play the crowd in those ways and get that kind of visibility. So he was, in a sense, I think he had that talent, but he was at the right place at the right time for it to be on display as well.
I think so, yeah. And what I think is that tends to overshadow the fact that there actually was a lot of political substance there. And there were some real concrete ideas that were actually executed by his government. So I think it was important politically as well as culturally.
Well, I remember all of the elections that Trudeau participated in. Beginning in 1965, where there was some buzz about the NDP in and around Montreal, but that kind of dissipated.
And he deserted them.
Yes. So I've ruminated on this issue of Trudeau and the NDP virtually all my life. A professor that I had at York University that I got along really well with because he wasn't on any of my committees was Jack Saywell, whose brother Bill Saywell was the president. Jack was a brilliant historian and observer of the political parade rather than a political theorist. But he went out on a limb, and if you could just hold out the pink book that was put together by Saywell and others, it was the first English translation of important works by Trudeau, but it also included one of Trudeau's first English language publications, an essay called Theory and Practice of Federalism, published in a book of 1960 called A Social Purpose for Canada. It's actually not a deep reflection on federalism, but it is a deep reflection on socialism. And Jack Saywell, as I said, he went on a limb and tried to debunk the notion that Trudeau was in fact a liberal. He called him a democratic socialist as opposed to a Stalinist or a Trotskyist. And I've never had much of a problem with that, except insofar as, of course, there are plenty of people on the right wing of things who, to them, calling Trudeau a socialist is a bad thing. It conjures up all kinds of monstrous images. It's rather like Rush Limbaugh called the Pope Francis a Marxist today.
I'd like to ask you more about that, the rest of the panel, in keeping with this idea of, the kind of liberal that Pierre was and the kind of liberal that Justin is. And, a great deal of attention is paid to similarities and differences between Pierre and Justin, and less focus, it seems to me anyway, in my experience of the media coverage of these things, on the ways that the Liberal Party itself has changed and the ways that the political landscape in Canada has changed more broadly in terms of political parties. So I think I have an image here of there are two, victories coming to the leadership of the Liberal parties at these different moments. And so I deliberately kind of pluralized that to ask you all to comment on changes in Canadian Liberal politics, but also the broader political landscape as well. Elise, I think you wanted to say something about that.
Well, and maybe I can tie it into the contemporary moment. I wanted to ask you, Alan, because one of the things that I think was his greatest weakness was his notion of the just society, which tacked on to this idea of, what was Lyndon Johnson's The War on Poverty? The Great Society, right? So it echoed the Great Society, which was very clearly a war on poverty, about economic injustice. Whereas people tried to pin down what Trudeau meant by the Just Society. And the Just Society would evoke economic justice, because he talked about everybody having the opportunity to be a Mozart. That he said it's not that everybody should have a piano and be able to play it, but anybody who has that potential should be able to explore that potential. But in terms of implementing any kind of economic policies at the federal level, that I don't think was his strength. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. But again, I would put it into context. The Great Society was on the skids in the United States by 1968.
Yeah.
And people around the Liberal Party certainly were aware of that.
Yeah.
The Just Society spoke to a broader vision of a more equal Canada, and it had, the anchor of it in Trudeau's mind.
Yeah.
When he talked about socialism, it was his long-term project, and it was the art of the possible at any given moment. The priority was about equality between Francophones and Anglophones.
Exactly, which is not a fundamentally socialist issue. It's more of a...
It's not a fundamentally socialist issue, but as you know from the history of Quebec, this was a driving force behind the new socialist sensibilities in the period after World War II. So a more equal society in that dimension, and once Anglophones and Francophones were in play, then there were all kinds of other groups in Canadian society who were knocking at the door. I think the extent to which the Just Society did speak to broad issues of equality has been understated at the expense of, obviously, a perfectly legitimate critique of its fuzziness at the time and its association with cookie-cutter social programs that Trudeau himself had grown skeptical of by the late 60s.
I mean, the throwing funding toward youth, which may be something, I don't know if that's something you want, but all the funding programs for youth was a very interesting experiment in terms of distribution of wealth to enable grassroots kinds of action. But what's really striking to me about, so comparing, and speaking of the two different time periods, Justin's new campaign, if you listen to his ad, and then if you remember Stephen Harper when he was running for his first win, it's the same ad. We care about the middle class. We're the party of the middle class. Well, of course, that wasn't the rhetoric at the time. So it's fundamentally very different. I mean, who their target audience is very different. The politics of the moment is very different. So there's nothing radical. There's nothing that even pretends to be radical or that you could mistake for radical in that the campaign, the present-day Liberal campaign.
Yeah, I mean, Chrystia Freeland, his star candidate, is all about the middle class and all that. And I mean, to some degree, we're talking about Trudeaumania and the image. Just Society was a great, catchy campaign slogan as well. So I think some of the fuzziness comes from maybe the fact that it wasn't fully philosophically articulated in a way. And Trudeau was really, I mean, I have no problem with you pegging him as a socialist either, but he was really ideologically, philosophically quite schizophrenic, right? He dabbled with all sorts of things. So there's great footage of him at the asbestos strike, saying, I call on people to rise in arms, and then he interrupts himself. Well, maybe not in arms. So he had that. He liked that revolutionary aesthetic, but he wasn't entirely comfortable. And in his youth, I mean, he's been criticized, in his youth in the 30s, of sympathizing with the fascist leader Adrien Arcand and things like that. So he really tried a lot of things, and the day he joined the Liberal Party as one of the three wise men, the three doves in French. I think that's an interesting dichotomy as well. He surprised a lot of people in the NDP who thought, well, what's going on here, and who felt that he was betraying them. But I think that's part of what the Liberal Party is as well historically in Canada, is this morphing thing constantly that changed under Trudeau, that veered quite far to the right under Chrétien and Martin, then collapsed, and now I guess we don't really know. That's the problem with Justin, is we don't know where he's taking it. I mean, as you say, talking middle class is very easy to do. It doesn't mean very much, and he's been very criticized for not giving us much of a sense of where it is that he wants to take this party. And so I think that's going to be the issue for him, is going beyond that image. And you talked about the substance underlying Pierre's Trudeaumania. We've yet to see it, right, for Justin.
So there are changes in the Liberal Party, but also in the nature of what a conservative is, at least in party terms in Canada, and in the NDP too. How has, if at all, have those changes affected what the Trudeau name means now?
Well, at one point in his discourse in A Social Purpose for Canada, Trudeau, and I believe he wrote it originally in English, he says the socialists must be on the left, but no further than that. In other words, everything is relative, a spectrum. You could accuse him of ideological relativism, as in cultural relativism. So the more the whole discourse shifts to the right, as has so brilliantly been engineered by the people around the Reform Party and the modern Conservative Party, the more Justin Trudeau or Kristen Freeland can be left, because everything is relative. Yeah. Now, I would say to Justin that he must drill down on this youth issue without, of course, imagining that young people are all of a sudden going to be, lining up to vote, because that's a long-term project. But he should learn from what literature there is about Trudeau's youth projects. Even his most admiring, or one of his most admiring biographers, Red Wansky, and maybe you've seen that book, he devotes a few pages to a quite detailed critique of the constant back and forth around youth programming. Personally, I spent one summer in the Army, courtesy of Trudeau's youth policy. That was the issue du jour. Another summer, in fact 2 summers, I got really good jobs in agriculture, wage subsidies for farm labor. That was the issue du jour, and no doubt had. And then I spent a lot of time with my friends trying to write up what they called YIP, trying to get money to do something that we wanted to do rather than the government's own priorities. But they were constantly shifting. You could never know what Ottawa's plans were on any given summer. But at least we were connected to Ottawa, you see? That was the brilliance.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. A number of you brought up Quebec already, and I guess I want to talk a little bit about this changing Canadian political landscape, cultural landscape, in terms of Quebec and in terms of these two Trudeaus as Quebecois politicians, right, at some level, right? So much was and continues to be made of the relationship between the Trudeaus and Quebec. And so I'm wondering about the different ways that Pierre inhabited and Justin now inhabits a Quebecois identity and that relationship, and what it says about how we think about him and read him today. Nicolas.
Looking at me here. Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? Use that old Facebook status. Both of them were involved in these very complicated relationships with Quebec, because both were seen in Quebec with quite a bit of suspicion as not being really part of the gang, as it were, right? They were francophones, but they were, or they are. It's hard when you're talking about one person who's alive and one who's not. But so Trudeau, he people in English Canada thought he was going to put Quebec in its place, right? And so that sat with some difficulty in Quebec, right? He came with this vision of a central government, and the charter, and repatriating the Constitution, and centralizing things on a federal level, at a time when Quebec was undergoing the Quiet Revolution and the aftermath of the Quiet Revolution and the referendum. So he was actually quite in a very he was quite outside the norm of political thought in Quebec. So that was complicated for him, and Trudeau's the same way. I mean, I don't think he's perceived, or he wasn't until recently. He's cultivated his image as a Québécois much more strongly now since in the last year or two, because he was very much seen as an outsider. I mean, he's raised in Ottawa. He's raised in English, and he's very comfortable in French now, but he wasn't for a long time as a young man. It was he gave that famous eulogy at his father's funeral entirely in English, which was quite, I think, surprising. And so he's also cultivated. And there was this controversy with him using the pronoun we when talking about Quebec, and people in Alberta and in Western Canada really got on his case for that. But that was clearly intended to try to boost his credibility as a Québécois, because both of them are they're a French Canadian background, but they don't fit the political, social, ideological mold at all.
I don't want to cut you off, but I just want to show these. What you were just saying makes me think of this, image on the right, of course, of Boisvert and Justin Trudeau. But then again, what you were just saying about being a Quebecer, but also not being on the right side of those questions. Did either one of you?
Well, the sovereigntists, of course, always pointed to the name Elliott, because there were Scottish skeletons in Pierre Trudeau's skeleton.
Well, René Lévesque did, and that really ticked Trudeau off, right? And he said in that famous speech for the referendum, and he said, my name's Elliott, but my name's also Trudeau, and then my name is Canadian and Québécois as well. Right. He really used that.
Yeah, well, the issue reached a bit of a boiling point in 1980, but you can rest assured that there'd been talk about that probably since Pierre was a boy in the 1930s, and talking about Scottish skeletons in the closet. I'm wearing a tie. This is the tie the clan Sinclair, to which Justin belongs. I want to make it clear that the branch of the clan that I got this tie from were not Liberals. They were very, very tough CCFers.
So maybe worth clarifying that Sinclair, you're referring to Margaret's father.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Yeah. And so Justin's grandfather.
I wonder if we could shift now to thinking about, all of the different ways in which people trade on Trudeau. This idea of the name, the famous images of Pierre, these famous moments, and I'm going to show a couple of these kinds of images, gestures and iconic words. That Justin trades on them, and so do his opponents. So I just want to show a few images. Obviously, the 1957, I think, Mercedes SL300 or something like that, convertible, roadster, something, that Justin famously drove on his wedding day with Sophie Grégoire. That was, of course, Pierre's iconic automobile. More recently...
it's kind of like the prince giving his wife his mother's ring.
I'll drive you away in my dad's car.
Dead people around you all the time.
And then this sort of famous example, I think it was earlier this year, where someone on a flight, I think from Halifax to Toronto, sent Justin a note asking him, on the plane, asking him, can you really beat Harper? And then, of course, Justin responds, just watch me, that famous line
Which is really problematic.
It's incredible. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, just because that story in itself is very, very, it's fascinating. And to go back to the whole question of the media and, how the media is very different now, if you look at the entire conversation Trudeau had, so this was during the War Measures Act, where or I think the War Measures Act, had been invoked, and so there's police everywhere, or at least it feels like they're everywhere, with, riot gear, or, whatever the version of it was in that time, and guns. And so this journalist is pushing him. And actually the journalist isn't very bright.
No, he's horrible.
No, it's terrible. And what's amazing is that Trudeau actually stands there and answers, talks to him for It goes on for about 8
it's
minutes.
Painfully long.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's this awkward conversation where they're both sort of camped in their positions.
Yeah.
And the journalist isn't very good at easy. And Trudeau's really just, I mean, he's
making mincemeat of him.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Without, but being respectful, like keeping the conversation going. And he's asking him, well, would you have me do this? Would you have me do that? Blah, blah, blah. And then finally, in the end, the guy says, well, how far would you go? And he says, just watch me. So it's very interesting because the quote has been used to make him sound like he's very cavalier. But if you look at the whole quote, maybe he is cavalier, but not quite as cavalier as it would sound as if he just said that.
Right.
So it was a very, I would say, one of the most serious moments in Canadian history, and very painful. Very, very painful. Emotionally and politically, that moment. So to say that, can you beat Harper, just watch me? You know, it's cutesy. It's not serious, Paul. I think that's my feeling about it, is it's just too easy and cheap. But maybe I take things too seriously.
No,
it's possible.
I agree.
Do you think it, I mean, he uses it, and I should just say that, you know, obviously the name as well, you know, and this idea, this is an anti-Justin, obviously. You know, we know Justin has a famous last name, but it's clear he doesn't have the judgment to be prime minister. So I guess I'm wondering about how he uses it to his advantage, sometimes being cutesy and cheap, but still sort of trading on that. And in all of this, pro-Justin sentiment, negative Justin sentiment, and ways in which Pierre and these iconic moments and words and events are invoked, is what's happening today changing the way that people think about Pierre. So we talk about how Pierre affects the way we think about Justin, but does the way that Justin is behaving, or some of these cheapening moments or whatever, is it changing the way that we think about Pierre Trudeau?
Well, I think it is influencing the literature. I mean, the most recent book on Pierre Elliott Trudeau is a hatchet job called The Truth About Trudeau by Bob Plamondon.
Yeah.
The dirtiest deal that Plamondon can find is the story of the swimming pool at Sussex Drive. There's still some murky questions about exactly who paid for the swimming pool, and did they get tax credits for which they should not have been entitled. I mean, if that's the dirtiest deal that Trudeau was involved in, that's small potatoes. Now that's not to gloss over issues like the waste in the old Department of Regional Economic Expansion. I mean, deformed socialist planning influenced, job creation politics in industrial Cape Breton, and plenty of money was lost, and that is fodder for the right wing today. But yes, I am willing to go so far as to say that some of the literature about Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau today, is really a polemic, a partisan polemic that is embedded in the Justin question.
And I think more kind of the collective memory of Pierre is certainly more prevalent than it might have otherwise have been had Justin not been taken. So he's more on our minds just because we're seeing Justin. Now that being said, Pierre's always a prime minister who's going to loom large on the collective memory of Canadians, right? There's no, independently of Justin, he doesn't need Justin for us to remember him. But how we remember him, I think, is in any case part of that. It has to do with that charisma, that style, that easygoingness, that catchy repartee as well. And that's clearly what Trudeau Jr. is trying to do as well, right? He's trying to, and so these poses of him, or this using "just watch me," or posing in the car. We talked about the way he poses in canoes as well, and he's trying clearly to evoke his father's memory, right? And that, I think, for a young politician is problematic because it's burdensome to carry a name like, of any way, whether you're the son of a famous athlete and you want to be an athlete, or you're the daughter of a famous artist and you want to be an artist, people are always going to judge you, right? So the fact that he's playing that up, I think, opens him criticism that he's not being his own man, and that he's just trying to ride the coattails of the Trudeau name. So I think he needs to be, if I were advising him, I'd say I think he needs to be a little bit careful with that. Can I just say something about the car?
Sure.
It's a great car.
Find the car. Yeah.
The car actually says a lot about who Pierre Trudeau was, and this is not a very sort of, I don't know. Is this a very middle class? It's not, you're that middle class suburban Canadian that Justin is trying to speak to can't afford that car. Pierre came, and Justin, the Trudeaus are a very wealthy family. Their father was actually owned gas stations, right? And the first automobile club made a lot of money that way. So they're a very wealthy family, and the car was very much part of Pierre Trudeau's image as a swinging bachelor and everything else. And then him famously riding away from 24 Sussex in '79 in that car, the journalist, right? It's part of his image, right? And I think that says a lot about his ability to connect with people in that way. And what's very revealing is his successor, Brian Mulroney, a conservative, wasn't able to get away. The lavish lifestyle that Trudeau led very publicly was part of his image. He was able to play that. Mulroney ran into trouble. He had to rent a Chevette for the leadership convention because he couldn't show up in his own luxury car, right? And so he was, again, another problematic figure, but he wasn't able to. It didn't sit well with people. So how it sits with Trudeau Jr., I think, remains to be seen.
But you know what's really interesting about that? If you read Margaret's autobiographies, they did not lead a lavish lifestyle at all. In fact, he was a complete penny pincher, and she was constantly imploring him to allow her to buy clothes. These wives of presidents from countries would come and visit and want to go shopping with her, and she didn't have an allowance to buy anything. And so sometimes they would buy clothes for her. Yeah. So he wouldn't spend. So it's interesting that's the perception.
But I think
it's the
that
flamboyance,
is a
right? That goes with the rose in the lapel. Yeah.
Well, I want to pick up on these ideas about family and the sort of origins of Trudeau 2.0, so Justin, and I guess a couple of you have referred already to the famous 2000 eulogy that Justin gives, where he tells a story about going to the North Pole with his father and seeing Santa Claus and realizing how powerful his father really was, and then talks about the name Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And people really looking back on Justin's political career now talk about this as this kind of political coming out moment, right? And I guess I wanted to ask about sort of family more broadly, because of course this is an image of Justin climbing up the steps to a plane that his father's at the top of, presumably, when he's 11 months old. And I wanted to sort of raise these issues of family and politics, right? Because one of the things that struck me as I was looking for images for today were these the incredible candor of these family photos of, in this case, Joe Clark too, these political leaders with their kids. And I wanted to ask about the sort of Canadian family values embedded in the Trudeau era and the ways that those compare. This is one of my favorites with the toques. What kind of Canadian family values, even though that wouldn't have been the term at the time, did Pierre and the Pierre Trudeau family embody? And Nicolas just mentioned the canoeing. And this, of course, is from Justin's tweet, I think in August. He tweeted that Sophie was pregnant with their third child, expecting a third child. So I wanted to ask you all about that, the sort of way in which family plays a role in the two Trudeaus and in that legacy story.
As a subtext of that, I have a question for you, Elise. Do you make much of the argument that Maggie Trudeau's role in the 1974 election was a bit of a game changer?
That's what she claims, and the experience was quite devastating for her. Thank you. So in the 72 election, Trudeau won only a minority government. I think he had only 2 seats over the Conservatives. And so there was a sense of, we need to do some real image work here. So they took more shots of him working at his desk with his sleeves rolled up, because he was very stiff, even though he was very sharp. And he was seen as playful. There's a famous photograph of him sliding down the handrail in Chateau Laurier, was it? Or
Buckingham Palace.
No. Buckingham Palace was the twirl he did behind the Queen's back. But this was during the Liberal campaign, and when he showed up to vote in his sandals and loose scarf, it was seen as scandal. Like, this was a really new person who was going to break down the stodginess of politics and really bring a new youthful breath into it, even though there was that part of him. In fact, once he was in power, he came across as it's interesting, much like Stephen Harper, really controlled the media, really controlled what he said. Nobody could get at him. And just to that point, I know I'm way off track now. When I actually met Margaret Trudeau once, and I talked to her about this, and she said she feels the reason why the media went after her so viciously when she left him and went to New York is because for years they had been trying to penetrate Trudeau and they never could, and finally they found a gap and they went for it relentlessly, and she became the target of it, which was very fascinating. But anyhow, so 72, surprising, right? Huge losses. So he's got to become more personable. So she played a key role. This is her story. She played a key role in doing that. And again, she suffered the price of being a political wife. She said it was the most, again, devastating experience because as soon as the election was over, everybody abandoned her. During the election, she was so important, right? By his side, helping him relax, the clothes, everything, right? And then as soon as the election was over, everybody, including her husband, just walked away, and it was as if she never existed. So it was very tough for her, but she feels that she's never been given proper credit for, and she wasn't at the time treated as someone who played a key role. And I think that's often the role wives do. It's just assumed you do that, and you're not really valued as a part of the team, a real part of the team. So
as a follow-up, would you say that this might influence the role of Sophie Gregoire? In 2015, her third child would be, what, 2 years old? If I were an image maker, I would be just frothing, at the prospect of bringing her and the kids into the fray.
And the 3 kids.
The 3 of them.
Well, she hasn't, has she played a very... You guys watch it more, contemporary politics more closely. I'm stuck in the past, but you guys, to me, she doesn't have much of a presence.
No, she's a woman in her own right in Quebec.
Yeah.
And she does not want to be a second fiddle to Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
And she plays that image of the, when they're together in interviews, she kind of berates him and plays that sort of modern wife image very, very well, right? And she plays perfectly. I don't want to read anything cynical into their relationship, but as she plays quite perfectly into the kind of the modern suburban middle class family that clearly they're going for as their next campaign move.
I think that to go back to the Pierre story, I think Canadians were so incredibly invested in those births. And the interesting thing, too, is the first 2 children were both born on Christmas Day, right? Like, you can't really plan that. And the other thing, too, again, as you can tell, I'm a collector of things, that Margaret told me, is they got thousands of gifts from people all over Canada. And wouldn't it be amazing if we could see, like, people knitting booties and people making little things, and just thousands and thousands of gifts they received from people all over Canada. So it really says so much about how personally affected and personally involved people were with that family. Do people feel a personal involvement with this family? I suspect not.
Perhaps not as much, but we haven't seen them as much either.
Yeah,
and that was part of Trudeau's modernity as well, is putting his family on display more. I don't think that previous generations of politicians did that quite so much.
But he's also younger, right? Wouldn't their children have been adults? Previous politicians?
Well, we had a long tradition of bachelor prime ministers.
That's true.
True.
But the fact that they were born at 24 Sussex, and and so I think that Trudeau is trying to speak to that baby boom generation as well, that remembers seeing him grow up, and now he's come of age, and so I think he's aiming for some sympathy as well, and the kids were very central to I think, an important shift in the image of Pierre as well, who was elected as a swinging bachelor. Didn't he date Barbara Streisand for a while and all that? And then he settles down and he marries and he becomes a family man, right? So the country is watching this transition. So that the timing of things is different for Justin in the sense that he's coming to the position already married and already having children, but he's certainly not shying back from putting his personal life on display, which other politicians don't necessarily do.
So to reiterate the hero-villain dynamic here, Maggie had to become a villain after her departure from Sussex Drive. There was no other way for the media to deal with that issue because of the investment made in the family. So there had to be a blame game. She was to blame.
Well, it possibly could have turned if she had done an expose on her life, which she did do in her book.
Yeah.
You should, if you haven't read those books, it's incredible how frank she is about their day-to-day life and Pierre's behavior, which was not very kind. So, yeah. But yeah, I think you're right. But women would be anyways, right? Especially because she went off to Studio 54 and got involved in that. So, you're just a bad wife and mother. That's a no-win situation, right, for women.
Well, we can come back to this sort of maybe full circle almost to this idea of Trudeaumania. I want to sort of ask about some of these moments, who Trudeau was as a personality, right?
Pirouette.
Here's the famous pirouette at the G7 summit in London. So he's doing a pirouette behind the Queen. Many of you probably already seen this image. Sexy. Yeah. I have no trouble understanding that, but that's just me. I grew up in a house where Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau in the 70s and 80s, he was the man. I mean, my dad was there too, but he was the man, right? And so that image of him is one that I kind of grew up with. And cool, I mean, wow, it's like Reservoir Dogs or something. And I guess this one really pulls it together. The Grey Cup. I'm trying to remember which Grey Cup this was. 1970, I think. This is crazy, sexy, and cool all at once. I think.
But a dandy, right?
But also a dandy. Yeah, he had.
He occupies masculinity in interesting ways.
Yeah, and I guess speaking of which, Justin, right? So is Justin? I mean, people certainly say that he's. I don't know about crazy, but inexperienced. The irreverence is there, maybe not backed up by the brilliance that people attributed to Pierre and still do. This is, of course, an invitation to a ladies' night that Justin was. There was a lot of controversy about this. Is Justin's ladies' night, and then crazy, sexy, cool. I don't know if he is any of those things. So this is, of course, from this famous boxing match. Against Patrick Brazeau that Justin actually won, and he was not the favored boxing match for charity, and he was not the favored boxer, but he actually beat Patrick Brazeau. So yeah, thoughts on Justin's sex appeal, his masculinity, his charm, irreverence, those things?
We have it on reliable police sources that what Rob Ford says
he had to come in today
on his famous
yes, that's right.
tape.
Yeah.
It was described in the Star as a homophobic slur, but what he actually says is Justin Trudeau is a fag. So, and believe me, that statement was made about Pierre Elliott Trudeau endlessly. So I think Canadian men have always had a bit of an issue with Trudeau. But it's an unstudied theme.
Well, I'd like to hear Elise on.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, in my opinion, and this is just a personal opinion, learned, of course, but.
I learned personal opinion.
Yeah. Justin Trudeau is generically good-looking. So what makes someone sexy? Right? It's never just generic good looks. There's got to be something deeper there. And I think that's why Pierre was sexy, was because there was a dynamism, there was an energy, an intelligence, and I guess the kind of like throwing off the shackles of the past, which was what this late 60s was all about. The willingness to be unusual and quirky and different, and that had an appeal because it's kind of dangerous, right? What's he going to do next? He's kind of a bit of an unknown factor, and he had this kind of aloofness. That's very sexy to a lot of people, an aloof quality. When he was first questioned, "Are you running?" He said, "Oh, it's just a practical joke." So he was very aloof about the whole thing. He never pretended to take himself seriously, but when discussing serious things, he was a very serious person. So he had this, charisma is the word that's used all the time, and I never met him, but the evidence certainly supports that. So you can be classically good-looking like Justin Trudeau, but I don't perceive him to be someone who has charisma. And I've also never met him. So I've heard that George Bush was incredibly charismatic and charming. If you met him, it was very disarming. You wouldn't sense that I would never have guessed that in a million years. So
not sexy.
What I'm saying is possibly he is charismatic and it just doesn't come across. But Trudeau's charisma did. So I think, I don't think he's cool. I think he's pretend cool. And in the way that like Trudeau was, and I don't think it was not constructed and self-conscious. I don't want to say artificial, because I think any performance of coolness is a constructed thing. It's not artificial. It's just something we put together, right? So it was. I'm not saying that it wasn't constructed and a performance. I think it absolutely was a performance. But he performed it well, and he pulled it off really, really well.
No, I agree with Elise. It was a performance. It was well, but it came across as unscripted, which, quite frankly, Justin isn't able to convey that, or hasn't been able to yet. But it comes back to what I think I was saying earlier about the time at which these respective politicians have come about. As you say, Pierre did, as Alan said, he said outrageous things, and he was breaking out of the shackles of the past and the more kind of conformist image people had of a politician. And I think now we've sort of returned to that sort of pre-Pierre Trudeau understanding of what a politician is. And Harper has done a great job of bringing the kind of political image back into that square box sort of mold, which now Trudeau, I think, is wary of challenging, right? Because, again, I don't know if it's the 24-hour media cycle, if it's the social media, the scrutiny of politicians. Every gesture is so he tries to be irreverent, but you can feel that he's constrained in doing it. So he goes to that ladies' night. He sort of makes an off-the-cuff remark about China, admiring China and their dictatorship, and this becomes like that's the news of the day. The next day is Justin Trudeau admires China. In the 60s, before he was running for the Liberal leadership, Pierre Trudeau said exactly the same thing, but nobody remembers that. It was because we didn't these off the cuff remarks didn't maybe have the same weight as they do now.
Justin clearly did not have a good education in sort of women's studies 101, because all he had to do at that event, which regime do you admire besides Canada, was mention Iceland. That's all he had to do.
Well, I'm aware of the time, and I want to make sure that we have a few minutes to ask to let the audience ask some questions. But I guess I just want to. I know you're historians, and I'm not supposed to ask you about the present, let alone the future. But all this said, the historian's perspective, or I guess the voter's perspective, whatever. Can he do it? So this is some latest polling. Information, statistics, and I guess I'm wondering, given all of this, what will Justin's victory mean if it happens? What will his failure mean if it happens? And from the long view of Canadian history, thoughts on that? I
I don't think he's Pierre. And I think he's been given this opportunity, let's say, because they want him to be Pierre. Because I think that's all the Liberal Party has going for itself. It doesn't have any ideas whatsoever. It's crazy, right? So perhaps the best possible outcome is, I think, well, just, it's so complicated because I don't want to say, anyways. The best possible outcome would be is if he found himself and became his own person, surprised us all, developed some good ideas, and won the next election. And because I don't even really think too much of the NDP anymore. I mean, they've abandoned the roots of the party, and so I'm NDP, Liberal. What's the diff? I'm not really sure yet. So yeah, that's my thoughts. I would really wish he would just be able to become his own person, but that party doesn't want him to be his own person. That's not why he's there. That's not what they think is going to mobilize grassroots. If he wins, I believe it will be. It's a vote against Harper. What Harper has, yeah, people. I mean, and the by-elections, I'm sure have a lot. Well, Toronto Central was always a Liberal riding, but
the Brandon
mostly.
one was interesting because you had. In certain, if you study social media, you learn that in these prairie cities, there's a lot of talk about strategic or tactical voting. Yeah. They know Harper really well, and they really hate him. Yeah. Apart from the Conservative base. Yeah. So in Brandon, you had the NDP vote just went over to the Justin Liberals, whose candidate was actually a disgruntled Conservative. Yeah. Yeah. The Liberal plane is still taxing on the runway. Yeah. Some people who claim to have inside knowledge say that Justin will be given 2 kicks at the can because the Liberal Party has been tormented by almost pointless infighting over leadership. The best option would, of course, be a coalition government whereby a more senior person like Mulcair could mentor Justin outside of the framework of strictly the Liberal handlers. And father-son relationships, we've talked about the Bushes, we could talk about the Winches, it's always complicated. The best thing to do is have a little bit of distance from your ancestor. Like Mulcair's illustrious ancestor was Honoré Mercier, who died in 1891 or 1892. Some say he was a sovereigntist. He was the premier of Quebec. Right. Some say he was actually a modernizing figure. He called the first provincial premiers conference. Monsieur Mercier did. That's right. So that's the ancestor of the modern day. What do they call? Council of the Federation. Yeah. So Quebec politics, all kinds of ambiguities, running through families, running through careers, and it's deeply structured and not something that any politician is going to wave a magic wand.
Well, we got started a little bit late, so I think we can steal a few moments for questions or comments from the audience. Is there anyone who'd like to step in here? Sure. Many people. Go ahead. If you can step up to the microphone, that would be great. That way everyone can hear your question.
Is it live? Is it on?
Yes. I think so, yeah.
Yep. Just a comment about the swimming pool. The swimming pool was left at 24 Sussex Drive. There was another prime minister that took all the furniture out, unpaid for. There's a lot of questions or comments on all the stuff you've said, but one thing you didn't touch on, I think, which is kind of interest to us in BC, is examining the difference between Christy Clark and Justin. Christy grew up in Vancouver. Her father was very active with Ron Bassford, and Christy grew up around the dining room table from the day she was born, talking politics. And a lot of people said Christy was light; she couldn't be prime minister, or premier. But she came along, and she's a tremendous communicator. And after all those years of sitting around arguing issues in her family, there's something in there that very few of us have. And I think you're underrating Justin in terms of that same sort of environment, that he grew up amidst a political family talking politics. And I'm not sure that's been totally seen yet, but I think it's embedded in them. And I would say it was about a year ago when the announcement for the Liberal Party leadership took place. And there's a little party out here for Justin. About 20 or 30 people were there. And the main question of Justin was, how tough are you? And how do you arrive at solutions to problems? And governing is, you've got to be constantly coming up with solutions for the diverse society we live in. And you've got to be tough enough to make the decisions. And then you've got to be able to communicate. And I think Justin is a communicator. He's brought a whole new wave of people into both politics and the Liberal Party in a way that I don't think any other party has in Canada. The Republicans and the Democrats had done it in the States. And he went into Papineau and won 3 elections in Papineau, which it was a tough fight, more socialist riding, and he increased his majority each time. And the other thing is solutions. So I think this comparison between the two, nobody gave Christie a chance 2 years ago, and there she is sitting on top of the heap. And
Thanks
Justin
for
has
your
that same
comment.
background.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Is there another question over here? On this side?
Oh.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask if you could comment and compare and contrast the political landscape of Justin Trudeau versus Pierre Trudeau on the subject of the importance of a central figurehead versus a broad liberal leadership team. To what degree is the leader important versus the team now and then?
Well, I think the leader is always important, and just this ties in with what the previous speaker was saying about the importance of the leader. And when it comes down to it, in an election, every election campaign, there's the bilan afterwards, and people always say, oh, well, they voted for the leader, right? Jack Layton's Orange Wave was about Jack Layton more than it was about the NDP. I think Christy Clark's victory was much more about Clark versus Dix and the image of those two. And so that's why there's a lot of stock placed by the Liberals on Trudeau and on that image. But I share Elise's analysis that we haven't seen it be quite enough yet so far.
Not sure who's next on which side, but...
Well, actually, they were next.
Okay, go ahead.
This follows a bit on the last two questions. We've been talking about personalities, Hollywood movie stars, maybe even deities. But we really want to be talking about political leadership and politicians who have a good understanding of national and international policy. As historians, to what extent do you think the Hollywood effect balances off in an election versus political competency or political understanding?
Well, I'll say that the Hollywood effect is absolutely pivotal.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Years ago, the Liberal Party of Canada was a kind of a team. Mackenzie King and Louis St. Laurent, they were not charismatic figures in any way, shape, or form, and nobody expected them to be. But today,
Mackenzie King posed with people like Shirley Temple.
Yes,
right?
very good point.
And take Obama in 2008, right? He was the movie star, the rock star, so it is fundamentally important.
But none of this explains Stephen Harper.
But Stephen Harper hasn't been faced with Jack Layton, and Jack Layton gave him a run for his money in quite an unprecedented way for the NDP.
I don't think Jack was the Hollywood effect.
Wow.
Really? No, I think he was all about mobilizing the grassroots, and it was a populist.
But it was about admiration for the individual, whether it's a Hollywood thing or a populist thing. It's about. I think these questions are revolving around the importance of the leader.
Yeah.
And certainly, again, that's what they're banking on, and that's what the Liberals banked on in '66 '66 when they chose Trudeau as their leader. He was seen. Joey Smallwood got up on a stage with Pierre Trudeau and said, "This man is going to bring to our party people who haven't voted before." And that's exactly what Obama did, and that's what Justin is trying to do by copying the tactics of Obama in terms of by study. He's got a whole team of people studying exactly what Obama did in various states. So I think it says a lot about politics then and now, about the importance of leadership. And I think Harper can be explained by the vacuum that he found himself. And I mean, he was elected in a minority in the context of the sponsorship scandal. But his predecessors were not Justin Trudeau's predecessors, his adversaries, were not charismatic people any more than he was. So it was kind of an even playing field in that sense.
We have time for one more?
When I think about 2015, what I'm concerned about is that we have a media which is no longer value-free. It's very definitely right-leaning, which I think is part of the reason why Harper did and has succeeded so far. What I would like to know is how can we hope to have any one leader and any one party actually take over the mess that Stephen Harper has left behind for us to deal with?
Thank you, Hank.
Who'd like
Hank
to
is
take
a
that
librarian, so he's very interested in the newspapers. I mean, obviously, we have to agree with you on the press, but there are new forms of media out there, and there's a lot of people getting a whole lot of information now, on Facebook and so on. I mean, follow the debates about the by-elections and that.
I think, I mean, there's pardon me, but I'm about to use a swear word. There's a group called Shit Harper Did, and they raised money to create a commercial which was aired during the Stanley Cup playoffs, I think, or they had to reach a certain level. And so that's an example of a grassroots organization that's trying to get a different message out there that the media is not particularly interested in covering. But, the media, though, the mainstream media has covered so much about the complete retraction of funding of environmental protection agencies, the silencing of scientists. They've covered all this, and nobody did anything until, the Senate scandal. And this is the nature, I think, of democracy. I don't think this is just this particular historic moment. I think it's been this way for a really long time. So I agree that the media, the contemporary media, is a problem, largely because of cutbacks. Nobody's buying newspapers. There's extraordinary cutbacks. So you have lots of bloggers who are just doing opinion pieces, not reporting, certainly not investigative reporting like we used to have, excellent investigative reporting. So that's not happening. So that's a real problem for us. But on the other hand, there is, as you say, social media that's creating new places where dialogue is happening. But I think the really big issue, and I think the reason why Justin Trudeau, who is young, right, so supposedly you would think capitalizing on youth, is selling to the middle class. Well, young people, they're never going to be middle class. They aren't. So he's not going after the youth vote, and that's a problem. My students don't vote. Many of them. I ask them all the time in the Trudeau course I teach. And they don't vote because they don't feel like it means anything. They feel like the system is corrupt. They feel like it doesn't make a difference. So, that's a real problem. And I think that's more than media. I think that's civics education in school, for example. I mean, there's so many ways in which people can feel like being involved is a valuable thing. And I don't think there's anything in our culture at this particular moment that suggests that.
Question over here?
Yeah, I came to the meeting. This is a discussion of the dynasty of the Trudeaus, and I came because I thought maybe there'd be some serious talk about substance of what Trudeau stood for. And I mean, we're sitting here, we're just talking trivia, and the problems on the planet and the problems in this country we're facing are just overwhelming. And if we're going to talk about trivia, then all these political parties are going to be talking about trivia. Trudeau, the little I remember about Trudeau is he brought in the Charter of Rights, right? So I get the impression people think that Trudeau is highly respected in this country. because of what he stood for. The last time I went to a court where I tried to argue the Charter of Rights, the judge told me I was promoting chaos and anarchy. I challenge anybody in this room to name one institution of authority, one judge in this province that has the slightest idea what the Charter of Rights is. The Charter of Rights doesn't exist in this country because nobody understands it, nobody takes it seriously. There's not one institution in this system in British Columbia that has any respect for the Charter of Rights, any of the provisions of the Charter of Rights. If you go to court and you challenge any of these institutions, the judges will just throw you out of court. So we talk about Trudeau being respected in the society when he did introduce a reasonably interesting charter, but it's laughed at. Nobody pays any attention to it. We live in a society where there is no rule of law because the rule of law is totally disrespected. So we live in a society, we basically here live in a fascist society where we do not work under the rule of law. Every institution of the society that rules our lives has absolutely no respect for the rule of law and no respect for Trudeau's charter. And so when we talk about Trudeau's and dynasty, I would think that we'd want to start talking about our rights. And, look at the news about our rights to privacy, surveillance, the right to protest. They're just introducing smart meters in this province, which will enable the government to photograph what you're doing in your bedroom and what you're doing in your bathroom and listen to everything you say. And nobody pays any attention to the charter. Where is the charter? I
think the charter is absolutely central to Pierre's legacy, and I think perhaps tonight we've maybe taken that almost for granted too much. But it was a very divisive thing, and I think this goes to your question about how Justin's presence. I mean, he really, I think his question spoke to that. How Justin's presence shapes our view now of Pierre. That was one of the questions you asked us a minute ago. And in some ways, maybe the fact that we're focusing on Pierre's charisma and his charm and all of that means that in some ways, Justin has managed to perhaps rehabilitate his father's image on that kind of superficial level, because now we're comparing Justin to Pierre and which one of the two was more charismatic, right? And so we're not, indeed, talking about the charter. And if I haven't given Trudeau much credit, actually, in anything I've said tonight, but if I can give him a little bit of credit, I think it might be in his ability to do that, because I remember when he was being touted as the next leader, and I thought to myself, does he really think he can trade on his name? And clearly he does, and clearly he has been able to. Because maybe before Trudeau, I think we forget how toxic actually the Trudeau name really was and continues to be. I mean, it's toxic in Alberta because of the National Energy Program. It's toxic in Quebec because of the Charter, because of the patriation of the Constitution, because of his outbursts post-Prime Minister against Meach and Charlottetown. And yet Justin Trudeau has been able to play that up in some very interesting ways and to define himself as a Quebecer and maybe make us forget some of these things.
Well, it's harder to have conversations about policy when Justin's positions we'll wait till next spring, so it's harder to
I think there was one last speaker at the microphone there. He's
just leaving. That's Neil. Oh, Neil, that was you.
But I just don't see him now.
That's Neil. There, sorry. I thought that was...
Come back, Neil.
So my question is actually about the National Energy Program, which really alienated the Liberal Party in the West. And then also the Mackenzie Valley pipeline project, which... put Trudeau in contest with Indigenous populations up in the far north of Canada. So what does that tell us about Trudeau as a figure trying to negotiate all these different regional issues, both in the 70s, and then what does that mean for the Liberal Party now when the West is now in Confederation, thank you, Stephen Harper, and we have a different kind of power in the West than we perhaps did in the 70s?
Well, I was involved in many debates about the National Energy Policy at the time, I sided with Mel Watkins, a nationalist economist at the University of Toronto, who called for something like a popular front in favor of the national energy policy. I could not possibly rehearse all the arguments, but this cookie-cutter idea that the national policy was anti-Western Canada or something, it's just wrong. That whole issue needs to be rethought and needs to go back to Charles-Émile Trudeau, the individual who started the gas stations. I believe that there was a sense in the Trudeau family that they had somehow sort of betrayed the nation a little bit by selling out. I think the chain of gas stations called Petro-Canada, the state oil company, was at a certain level Trudeau's recapture of those earlier visions. Thanks for the question, Neil. I think there's a doctoral dissertation there for sure.
Should we take one last question?
Well, I just want to say further to this issue of, the just society and equality. I mean, we really saw with the white paper that came out, and then Harold Cardinal's response to it, The Unjust Society was the title of his book, is that his notion of equality was genderless and raceless. Maybe there was some class understanding, but he didn't get feminists at all. And in fact, in one very important political conversation around the right to have access to abortion, he was incredibly obnoxious. So he really didn't quite grasp that, and he needed to politically learn to do that because, of course, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women happened, and then his party during that time took a leadership role with creating the Office of the Status of Women. But it didn't come to him naturally. Same as around Indigenous issues. So that's why I have difficulty seeing him. Well, the socialists weren't particularly better at that, but I do see him more as a kind of classical liberal in the sense of, equality of opportunity, right? This notion that there aren't differential kinds of inequality that need to be understood and accommodated, that you can't just say, Yeah.
Well, the NDP was on a learning curve, and we've got some good master's literature in our library about that.
Yeah.
The person who led Trudeau into a new way of thinking about Aboriginal people and Northern development was Thomas Berger, who was the pro-Aboriginalist faction leader in the West Coast NDP. So no matter how you look at it, there's this dialectical dance going on between the two.
Last question.
I've just been very interested about this discussion as to Justin's image now and the youth vote. That picture of Justin Trudeau and the senator against whom he won the boxing match has taken off on social media. And mostly among non-Canadians to whom the name Justin Trudeau means nothing, which is very, very interesting. But of course, Canadian social media people now have picked it up and are beginning to show this as well and seem quite entertained that he has had this sort of level of value to non-Canadians who are now interested. Oh, very attractive politician. Now we have this image of the very attractive Canadian politician as in the heads of non-Canadians. And I think that also this is going to accidentally create some youth vote, as well as this, Justin unplugged, what's your favorite virtue? Not really connecting with the demographic that he thinks he's trying to connect to. We also have this image of Justin as educator, and I'm interested that this didn't come up because he was a teacher. This new ad that's come out, it's about a minute long, I think, with him... gesturing to a chalkboard. To what extent does that speak to his target audience in terms of getting a vote?
That's a great question, and it makes me almost think that maybe they're not entirely sure yet on the Liberal Party just what their target audience is, and this is what's happening in these kind of in-between election cycles, is that there's some trial balloons going out around, right? And just how to frame it, how to pitch it is part of what they're figuring out right now. And I think we'll have a much clearer answer to that question 2 years from now.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of confusing messaging. Because what does that mean? I mean, he was a teacher, but only in private schools, right? He was also in public. Oh, okay. Well, I take that back then. But he didn't make a name for himself particularly. He wasn't a leader in education in any kind of way. So this is kind of him countering the rhetoric that he's a rich kid, nothing, right? So he's kind of establishing himself as an authority. But it's not a message of compassion. Like usually we associate teachers with compassion, the caring society. But that's not the message. I don't feel that's a clear message coming out of his party. So it's I think it's very maybe unfocused and directionless. They're trying to I guess see if something takes off. Maybe, I don't know how these strategies work.
Do youth care about sharing and compassion? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I think it's a huge issue. Yeah. I had 60 students this semester. One of them belongs to a political party and one of them votes.
Really?
That's it?
That's it. And that's the same person, so...
Well, on that really uplifting note, I want to thank the members of the panel, Alan, Elise, and Nicolas, for joining me tonight, and all of you for coming tonight for this conversation and participating. Thanks so much.